Hello and welcome to one of the online events for Chicago Theological Seminary's Colloquium on Violence. I am Ayanna Johnson Watkins, the Director of Community Life, and I'm excited to introduce you to our colleagues here who are going to say much more about the subject and the ways it impacts us. First, Dow, if you could introduce yourself.
I'm Dow Edgerton, Professor of Ministry here at Chicago Theological Seminary since 1983. So 31 years. I teach courses in preaching, worship, and practice of ministry. Courses like Poetics of Grief, Forgiveness, Interpreting the Parables. So that's what I do.
I'm Reverend Dr. Susan Thistlethwaite. I'm a professor of theology here for approximately as long as Dow. But I took 10 years out of that schedule to be president of Chicago Theological Seminary, and I'm the immediate past president. Issues of violence and violation, both interpersonally and also peace and war, are the center of my constructive work as a theologian and have been for all of my adult life.
Yay.
I am Dr. Eddie L. Cornegay Jr., CEO and founder of the Baldwin Delaney Institute for Academic Enrichment and Faith Flourishing here at Chicago Theological Seminary, and a proud graduate with the STM and the PhD in Theology, Ethics, and Culture from the Chicago Theological Seminary. So I've been a part of the community since 2003. And matriculated in 2012 and established the Institute here this past fall. And the Institute's mission is to eradicate violence and social inequities amongst youth and marginal communities. And so it's an outgrowth of my own scholarship, which is concerned with the eradication of violence as it relates to communities that are suffering from the pandemic of violence in many different ways.
Well, as you can see, we have a lot of wisdom in the room, so let's get started right away. Dow, if you could tell us a little bit about the colloquium itself.
Well, periodically, the seminary sets aside time. We interrupt our normal business to talk about things that matter to us in different ways. And last year, the subject of the colloquium was racism. And this year, the subject is violence. And what we do when we have a colloquium is we draw upon internal resources as well as external resources. We come together in plenary as a community of the whole. We invite people to go to classes they're not registered in. We invite professors to invite members of the community into their particular classes. And everything is tuned on this day to this question of violence and how it touches what we do in all the areas in which we teach. So if we're teaching about religion in America, there's an important history of violence in relationship to that. We're talking about systematic theology or ethics. We're talking about reading the Bible. All across the curriculum there are these interweaving themes. And so this is a day where we set apart time to do this. And this year we will have as resource people Dr. Stephen Ray, a professor of theology from Garrett Evangelical Seminary. He will offer a kind of almost like a keynote in the morning on violence. And we will also have the Youth Empowerment Project, which will be doing a wonderful and difficult dramatic performance. And we'll have the screening of a new documentary on incarceration, which features three of our own faculty members, Dr. Lee Butler, Dr. Joanne Terrell, and Dr. Rachel Mikva. And then we also have other members of the community who will be leading workshops like Dr. Cornegay and like our own students. So one will be working on trauma narratives coming out of her master's work, and another will be working on violence and black women's bodies. And we'll have some time for body work and meditation and prayer. We will worship together, and we'll be exhausted by the end of the day, and possibly exhilarated too. So that's what a colloquium is, and that's what we'll be doing next week.
Excellent. A great exhilaration and a good reason to be exhausted.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Susan, you've been a domestic violence counselor and Just Peace activist for years now. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you think your work will impact this conversation and a little bit about the structural dynamics of violence?
Thanks, Ayanna. I come out of the movement to end violence against women. That's kind of my primary touchstone on these issues. And in the early 70s, women sat around in circles like this, and in church basements or in living rooms. And each person went around the circle and told about what had happened to her. And the cumulative effect of all those stories was to have people realize, not just me, it's not just me. And the same justifications that the person beating you uses are being used against me. And so 2 major insights came out of this. And that's pretty much what's called consciousness raising, critical consciousness, where you realize it's not me, it's not my fault. There's a system, it's set up against me. And yet, we were taking action together to change that. And I was in both Durham, North Carolina, and then in Boston with a lot of this work. And we raised the money to build battered women's shelters. I volunteered on the very first rape crisis hotline in Piedmont, North Carolina. And people would call that hotline. And I was the only pastor who was answering calls. And people would want to talk to the pastor. And they would say 2 things. I'm a Bible-believing Christian, but. And so I wrote perhaps one of the most famous things I've ever written, called Every 2 Minutes, Battered Women in the Bible. And there are texts of liberation in the Bible, and there are texts of submission. And how do we use our critical consciousness to read these texts and to have liberation that's empowered through faith? My colleague, Mary Potter Engel, with whom I did the book Lift Every Voice, once said, the most liberating question you can ask is, who the hell set things up like this? That's structural violence.
That's an excellent question. Dow, I'm wondering what relationships there might be between the representations of violence in the media, in our stories, in our movies and things we see, and the violence that we experience, the violence in our streets, our communities, our homes.
Stories matter. Dramas matter. Imagination matters. And if they didn't, why would we be reading our scriptures? Why would we be singing our hymns? Why would we be enacting our rituals and our liturgies? These things matter. And they shape us. They shape us internally. They shape us in our relationships. They shape us in how we order and organize our world. They shape these structures that Professor Thistlethwaite's talking about. These things matter. And it is unfortunate that the most substantive discussions that you have about the relationship between these stories and these dramas and this imagination and violence in our country takes place only in the aftermath of something that is horrific, and usually in response to a question about legislation. What should the law be? What should the policy be? And it lasts as long as the media cycle lasts. But this is about formation. This is about how we learn. This is about our identity. It's about who we become together. So I believe that stories matter, and dramas matter, and imagination matters. And therefore, the question of what do I see? What do I read? What do I support? Years ago, a member of our family, a young woman named Jody, was abducted and raped and murdered, and her body put in a refrigerator, cast off into the Mississippi River. So we did not find her for months. And when she was finally found, we could have a funeral. And I remember that going to that funeral. I was not presiding. I was just there as one of the mourners. I remember the feeling of despair that I had going, and thinking, what in the world can anybody say? What is there to say? And I can tell you, Ayanna, that I don't remember anything else that was said that day, but I remember one thing with absolute diamond clarity. the minister said, "I hope you have paid your last dollar to be entertained by violence."
Whew.
And that just, it sticks like a diamond in, in the middle of my head. And that, now they made it sound like a deep thing to say, but for me, I'm not powerless, am I? There are things that I can do and not do. There are things that I can say no to and yes to, and it has everything to do with the stories that we tell, and the dramas we enact, and the dreams that we dream, the imagination, the songs that we sing. So I believe there is a profound connection among all of them. And I want to have the conversation at that level, not about what should the law about these things be. I want to say, let's talk about it more deeply.
It's powerful. Stories matter, and power matters.
It does.
In both of your stories, you get to see a little bit of how we may have some power that we don't know about. All of us, all the players in this story. Eddie, I would love to hear more about the work that you're doing to bring together some of these conversations that are happening in separate realms, right? In the church, in the academy, even in the media and the culture, and how we can talk a little bit more about the eradication of violence that the Baldwin Delaney Institute is working on.
Yes. Well, I'd have to say that everything that I am, especially as a scholar, is an outgrowth of what these senior scholars have been doing and are doing currently with their work and their concerns about community and violence. And so these epistemologies of violence are something that is very much affecting the outcomes of the decision-making processes of our youth, and spurring much of the violence that we see now. And so I've noticed that decision-making processes have been weaponized and caricaturized in story, in print, in film, and even elevated to the level of it not just being a practice, but being kind of purposeful in terms of the intents of what it means to be humans in many ways. And so the work of the Institute, while it is concerned with the eradication of violence, it is also concerned with how do we as scholars engage in activism that is able to impact the church so that the church can impact culture. And so to undo this culture of violence. And so eradication is a very intentional word for me. I think that prevention, we need to attempt to move the needle, right? Move the needle from prevention to eradication. And eradication for me is a biblical perspective, actually. Anytime I look at the gospel of Jesus, it's not about prevention, it's always about eradication. Even in Luke 4, where Jesus talks, not Luke 4, but John 14, where Jesus talks about doing these greater works. And so not only can we do the works that Jesus does, we can do even greater. And the greater is eradication. And I think that Chicago's Theological Seminary sits on the cusp of being able to do this kind of work. It's already established it. There's enough room for to create the space for these kinds of things. And so I just see this as kind of taking the ball and running with it, and having the opportunity here at this particular time, I think is providential.
I like that, taking the ball and running with it. We already have the ball. It's time to run with it. And our mission is transformation, creating leaders who transform, right? And that means we can't leave the culture or the world or the church or the academy like we found it.
Absolutely.
I mean, it implies that. Susan, you've said before, violence loves to lie. Can you say a little bit more about that and how it relates to what we've been talking about?
War doesn't come to us saying, I'm going to kill everybody in the room. It says, I'm just war. Right? We don't say, I'm going to authorize people to use handguns to kill African Americans because I feel threatened as a white person. No, we call that standing your ground. We don't call battering of women in their home what it is, an attack. Oh no, violence likes to cloak itself in discipline. We don't call rape the violent assault that it is. We say, like Robin Thicke, you know you want it. Well, you know what, Robin Thicke? No, we don't. And so, but violence gets along because it's a deceiver. Now, who do we know the deceiver is, right? We know your name. We know your name. And if you're gonna work on violence eradication, you have to call violence by its name. Just like Jesus said, I know you, you're legion. Well, you think Jesus was not aware of the fact that Romans organized themselves in legions as military occupiers? Sure he did. And so he had a name for war, and it was demonic. So, and I was thinking when you both were talking, I had some conversations with people about 12 Years a Slave. And friends going, I can't see that. It's too violent. Now, I know perfectly well that these people had seen Halloween 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 12, had seen every violent, car chase movie. And 12 Years a Slave asked you to be a witness. Those kinds of media representations ask you to be a voyeur. They ask you to consume violence, which then in turn furthers the lie. What was disturbing to people about 12 Years Slave, it was the truth. It was the truth. People hate to witness to the truth about violence. So when I say violence loves the lie, I'm speaking theologically, because violence needs to be called out by its name.
Oh my goodness. I remember from my own work in domestic and intimate violence, they would say secrets breed abuse.
Yeah.
If we would just tell it different than how it is,
Oh, absolutely.
then we can keep this going. Absolutely. It's so powerful. And it brings up this question of, once we've experienced violence, seen it, borne witness to it, where is the place for forgiveness? Dal, you teach a class on forgiveness. Would love to hear a little bit more about how you work with that.
Thank you. The movement from harm to resentment to revenge to violence to harm to resentment to revenge to violence is a constant kind of movement. And I don't think there's probably any clearer representation of this than in the work of Andrew Sung Park and in his work on From Hurt to Healing, Theology of the Wounded. When he introduces to a North American context the concept of Han. A powerful sense of shame, anger, resentment that builds and builds and builds. It builds within a person, it shapes relationships, it shapes families, it shapes communities, it shapes history even. So Han can be not something that's only in my heart, but something that stretches across generations. And this cycle of harm, resentment, revenge, violence is a deadly cycle. And one of the things that Professor Park is asking is, how can we interrupt that? How can we interrupt it? So when he speaks about forgiveness, which is one of his primary concerns, he actually has a very pragmatic concern. It's not simply that forgiveness is a virtue,
Sure.
or might be a virtue, or that it is a theological value, which it is certainly something that's a very important part of Christian discourse. But it's something about saving lives. It's something about interrupting this cycle of harm, resentment, revenge, and violence again. There was a very compelling play a couple of years ago. Dale Orlander Smith, a woman from New York, who wrote a play which she performed by herself, called Black and Blue Boys, Broken Men. And what she did was she constructed characters. I believe there were 5 or 6, and she played every one of them. And the only props on the stage were chairs, and she played them as young boys who were subject to different kinds of violation, and then she portrayed them as young men who themselves were violators. And the boys that she was playing, one of them was like from the Midlands in England, Another was from suburban New York. Another was from the Bronx. Another was from Harlem. And I was astonished when I went to see this play. And one of the things that astonished me was, how does she, as a middle-aged African-American woman, how does she know what has happened to these boys? How does she know what happens to them as they become men? And how does she know so well that she can embody it on the stage? Well, it's powerful insight into powerful compassion, powerful empathy into what these cycles of harm, resentment, violence, really look like. So I think that the discussion of forgiveness is often truncated because it starts with a question of forgiveness rather than starting with a question of harm. And I think that the articulation of harm, the serious articulation of harm, is the first responsibility. Because until we are able to name, if violence loves the lie, violence also loves the silence, as you were pointing out. So how do we name this? And how do we come to recognize ourselves as people who have been harmed and as those who have harmed others? How do I recognize my own capacity for harm? I'm persuaded that one way not to take me seriously is not to take seriously my capacity for harm.
Wow. That's powerful.
And I want to be free of that too.
Well, amen.
Amen.
I'll sign on to that. Really, speaking of which, how can we be free? What can we do to make a change in this, a dent in this? I'd love to hear more from you, Eddie, about how you believe and hope the work that you're doing will begin to create this kind of concrete change in all of us.
Yes. Well, what Dr. Thistlethwaite and Dr. Edgerton are speaking about, especially about this naming. One of the things, two things that James Baldwin talks about the most, love, and probably the thing that he talks about secondly the most is rage. And he also talks about dissembling rage, unmasking it so that we can see it for what it really is and to name it. And so my hope is that we can dissemble rage, and which is actually taking off the masks, I think, that create much of the violence that we see, or what much of the violence hides behind. And so ultimately I would like to see that the work that we do make a difference, move the needle, so that it's no longer prevention, it is eradication, it is being able to be true to who we are, and to be able to forgive, and to not find fault. Yes.
And I want to be free of that.
Yeah. And I think that's the goal, is to be free of the capacity to commit harm by dissembling rage to eradicate violence.
That's powerful. It's almost like what I hear is the opposite of violence may not necessarily be peace. It's the truth.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
You know, if we can
Yes.
just tell it and live in it and own it, and then begin to move beyond it,
Yes.
let it go,
Yes.
and we might have something.
Yes.
Thank you all for this conversation, for your sharing, for your honesty, for your scholarship. And I pray this conversation will continue both in person and on CTS Connect. I look forward to continuing to engage with you as well as all of you who are watching. Thank you very much.